Previously, she served as an ethics fellow at the U.S. Naval Academy and as a fellow at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom on the Department of State's Core Group on Religion and Foreign Policy. And you can see she has a lot of work she's done with various groups, NGOs, and governmental organizations. She's also a New York Times best-selling author. Her recent publications include her book, Global Issues Beyond Sovereignty, God and the Bomb, Just Peace in Religion and Peace, Women, Religion and Peace in Illuminating the Unseen, Interreligious Peacebuilding and Fratelli Tutti in Interreligious Peacebuilding, and many, many other articles, chapters, and books. She also is a columnist for America Magazine, a leading Catholic publication, and she won a Catholic Press Award for her publications therein. She earned her PhD from Johns Hopkins University, her MA from the University of Texas at Austin, and her BA from St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. Dr. Love lives on the Chesapeake Bay, outside of Washington, D.C., with her husband, Richard Love, and their 3 children. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Love.
Thank you for coming today, and thank you for inviting me to be here. I wanted to thank the Center for Applied Ethics, thank Hong Kong Baptist University, the Department of Religion and Philosophy, and Co-Curricular Learning for inviting me to be here today. I'm going to talk with you about the changes in the ethics of peace and war, and the title, Preparing the Future. And a little bit of a side, when I got the title from the conference organizers, they said, "Is that a typo? Did you mean to say preparing for the future?" And this is actually a title from Pope Francis. And I was on the COVID-19 security task force for Pope Francis. And his specific directions to us were that we were to prepare the future and not to prepare for the future, as if the future was something coming at you and you just had to react in whatever way you could, but to restore our agency and our sense of co-creators, that we could be part of preparing the future. And specifically with regard to COVID, he said, the pandemic has revealed the inequities in our current system. So we should not be trying to return to a status quo ante, but instead should be trying to build a more peaceful, more just future. So that's a little footnote on the title, a little backstory on the title. So I'm going to talk with you today about the changing ethics of war and peace. And really, we face these existential challenges, from global climate change to nuclear war. And we have more people than ever before on planet Earth. We have 8 billion people, more than ever before. We have more countries than ever before. How many countries would, if somebody wanted to take a guess, how many countries do you think we have in the world today? Anybody want to guess? 300, close. Yes. Yeah, so that's about, when we go for the Olympics, there are over 200 who will to catch up with that. So just war tradition has been a very common ethical tradition to look at issues of war and peace. It's still very necessary. My viewpoint is it's necessary, but it's not sufficient for the times that we are in now, because it tells you how to limit war, which is very important. We should limit war, okay? It's very important, but it's not sufficient. It doesn't tell you how do you build peace among very diverse groups. Not only do we have 193 countries, we have about 8,000 nations, people groups, who might share a culture, identity, religion, history, and that's actually a conservative number. Others use a much larger number of 14 to 15,000 if you would take it to tribal groups. So there are many, many different people groups on this planet, and we have to find better ways to cooperate than ever before. The title also, Preparing the Future, comes from a United Nations summit that will be coming up this year. So I encourage you to stay in tune with this. Part of the reason for the summit on the future is the idea that we're not on track to meet our sustainable development goals. The good news is the world has come together to try to improve our performance on peace, on prosperity, on reducing poverty, and on taking care of our planet. So we've had great increases in those, but the Sustainable Development Goals, obviously the pandemic has derailed that. So the Summit on the Future is to try to get our momentum back in working to build a more just and sustainable future. The Sustainable Development Goals advanced from the original Millennium Development Goals to focus more on the planet and sustainability of peace with the earth as well as peace with each other. And those are, of course, themes that Pope Francis takes us forward. So here's just the graphs of what I've just told you. We have more people than ever before at 8 billion. We might get up to 9 to 11, depending on which estimate you think, by 2050. We have more countries than ever before on the planet. But here's the interesting part, and lots more people from different ethnic and cultural groups. War has declined at that same time, very counterintuitively. So we have more people than ever before, more countries than ever before, lots and lots of different national groups. And the number of wars, which in social science we have a definition, is people, when you have more than 1,000 battle-related deaths in a calendar year. That number of wars has radically decreased. We had 34 major wars going on planet Earth at the end of the Cold War. Today there are 8. So a radical decrease in the number of major wars. Now I often get a lot of pushback from people when I tell them that the data shows an increase in peace. It doesn't feel right because of course we're seeing the headlines of horrific violence in Ukraine. We're seeing the conflict in Palestine and Israel right now. And those things are absolutely true. So just like it can be sunny today in Hong Kong and raining in the Philippines at the same time, and those are true, so similarly, we can be seeing rising peacefulness around the world, ends of very long-standing conflicts in Northern Ireland, in South Africa, in Colombia, in the Philippines, where they're moving towards much greater peace, at the same time as we see horrific war in Ethiopia and the Ukraine. So those things are happening at the same time. Now, it's not a straight line. We do see the number of conflicts goes up and down per year, and we see the numbers of casualties go up and down per year. And this last year was terrible. We had the most casualties ever since the end of the Cold War. So a big increase in the number of casualties from war, even while the numbers of wars remain low. But that was primarily from one conflict. And that one war is one that has not grabbed any headlines, and that was the war in Ethiopia. The war in Ethiopia was more people killed than all the rest of the world's wars last year. So yes, an increase in the number of casualties, but it's still true that more people on the planet are existing in more peace than ever before. These are just graphs to show you what I've just told you. And the two red lines on the one side are World War I and World War II, which the numbers of casualties were so great that they literally, the term off the chart is true here. You can't put them on the same chart. So that's my poor attempt to try to show them on the same chart, because you can't find any graphs, social science graphs that show them on the same chart, because you can't do it. You would need reams and reams of paper to have these very long lines for World War I and World War II. But you can see the direction of many, many fewer wars, many, many fewer casualties. This one is important because this one shows you from the 1500s, so a longer time period than just the 20th century, which was the bloodiest century in human history. Shows you that great power wars, wars between countries, was very, very common through most of human history. And when you have all of these great power wars of two countries that are very well armed, very powerful countries, going to war with one another, you can imagine, it gets you the chart we just saw, with very, very high casualty levels of World War I and World War II, when you have countries going to war, great powers going to war with one another. But you've seen this really huge decrease in the number of wars among great powers. So those wars that remain, and here we are in this period I'm talking about, this great decrease in war since the end of the Cold War, has been almost all civil wars. Well, what does that mean? That means that the combatants are not very well armed, they're not very well financed, they're not very well trained, and so you don't have very high levels of casualties that you do when you have great power war, because with great power war you have modern, industrialized, well-financed, well-trained armies going at it, and they can do a lot of damage, okay? So, of course, you see more casualties from war last year because we have a war among countries between Ukraine after Russia's invasion. So of course you would expect to see the casualty levels go up last year. So what does this have to do with the ethics of war and peace? Well, the ethical traditions, okay, and the ones that have been very dominant, the just war tradition, that tradition evolved when great power war was very common, okay? And it's very clear to understand why that tradition would be very popular, very persuasive, very important in the 20th century, because remember, the 20th century was the bloodiest century in human history. So if you had great power war happening with very high levels of casualties, the just war tradition absolutely has very important things to tell you. It tells you that even during war, we never lose our moral compass, we retain our moral compass during war, and that there are limitations to war. It's not true that in war anything goes. We retain our moral and ethical compass, and there are limitations to war, limits to when you can go to war, limits to who should be targeted during war. Civilians should never be targeted during war. So very important contributions that just war tradition has made to our, not only our ethics, our discussion of what should happen in the public sphere, but also in institutions. This ethical tradition has been very well institutionalized. In fact, you're all incredibly familiar with it. Even if you've never taken a class yet, which I urge you to do from my colleagues who will tell you about these types of traditions, but even if you've never taken those philosophy or religion classes or history classes where you would come across just war tradition, you're all already familiar with the basic components of it. You all already know it's wrong to target civilians, that women and children should be protected during wars. That comes directly from these folks who established just war tradition. So it's been deeply institutionalized in international law, the Geneva Conventions that put restrictions on warfare. All of that comes from just war tradition. So it's a very important tradition, and I'm not suggesting we throw it away or set it aside. But what I am suggesting is that with the different landscape we face today of different types of conflicts, we need something different to help us build peace. Just war tradition tells you how to limit war. It doesn't tell you how to build peace. It says you should. It said peace should be your aim, but then it is silent on what to do about that problem, okay? And so that's where just peace tradition comes in, and this is where I've been focusing my research and my work with NGOs and civil society groups, religious actors around the world. I've been going to war zones, talking with people and seeing what are they doing to build peace around the world. And out of that kind of ethnographic research, these are the criteria I've come up with. These aren't my ideas, these are what people are doing in areas of war as they try to build peace. So these are the 5 criteria that they are using to build peace in war zones around the world. In places where there have been long-standing conflicts, like the Philippines, like Colombia, how are they trying to put the pieces back together again after 40 years of war? How do you do that? How do you try to put society back together again? These are the criteria they're using, but they're not just moral ideas. They are very practical principles that each come with associated practices to put into implementation. So it tells you how to get from, we'd like a more peaceful world, to what specifically can you do about it. So it's a very practical ethics. It has a real track record of success in war zones around the world, but I want to caution, just peace is not a perfect position. They are not trying to get to some perfection. They're trying to get to more justice and more peace. More than there used to be, but there are still very long-standing problems. So when I go to Northern Ireland and I talk with colleagues there, I talk with folks who are working on peace building, they say, yes, we've come a long way. Yes, we have the Northern Ireland Peace Accords. Yes, we have greater participation and greater voice. But let me show you the, quote, peace walls, which are very large walls that still divide the identity groups in Belfast. So they still have problems. So these are not some kind of panacea. But what they do is they help you to imagine a world that includes your adversary. and help you find ways to bring social cohesion and equity together and to build better relationships with the idea that peace is built on relationships. And so you have to have better relationships to have a better peace. So peace, the whole idea is it's all about relationships. If you want to have a better peace, you will build stronger relationships. There are religious ideas behind this, but even if you're not a religious person, you can understand that we are all social creatures. We need to live together in some sort of social harmony, and therefore you need to have better relationships. And when the relationships improve, so does everything else, okay? So does everything else. So we see examples of this working very well in places like Northern Ireland, where they have integrated their economies, where there's been an expansion of women's participation in politics, where they've disarmed the different combatants and created social ties to bring them together. In Colombia right now, one of the biggest experiments is how to put that country back together again after over 40 years of horrific armed conflict with horrific human rights abuses. But they are putting these processes into place to try to build a stronger peace in Colombia. In South Africa, after apartheid, of course, they had their Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Certainly not a perfect process, a lot of problems and critiques, but it was a model for others that after a war, you actually have to tell the truth. And if you don't tell the truth, the society won't be able to move on. You have to have truth be part of the process of reconciliation. So the first part of it is participation. You have to expand participation. And you have to expand participation, including those who've been most harmed by the conflict. So that means women, it means youth, it means communities, indigenous communities, or those who have been marginalized. And there's actually a lot of social science research that shows this isn't just a good idea to do ethically, but it works better. So the whole Women, Peace, and Security initiatives at the United Nations that say countries need to include women more in peace processes. 20 years ago when they first started these resolutions at the United Nations, there was only 3% of peace accords included a single woman as part of the discussion, meaning 97% of the time women were entirely excluded. It's actually even worse than that, because most of that was one country of the Philippines. And the Philippines had a female president and therefore had some women in top leadership positions, so that it was really the Philippines that was responsible for that entire inclusion of any women in peace accords, and the rest of the world none at all. So they found that when you expand inclusion, you actually get a better outcome. You have more constituents for peace, you have more people willing to build peace, you have more people taking ownership, you have a more wisdom of the people who are most impacted by the conflict and might be able to tell you better answers for how to build peace if you actually ask the people who've been most harmed by the conflict. So there's lots and lots of good social science that says if you expand participation, you actually get a more durable peace. Okay? And if you exclude a narrow participation, you may get a peace accord that's written on paper, and then it won't be implemented. It won't be worth the paper that it is written on. So participation is really key. Restoration is very important. And this means more than just rebuilding the roads and the bridges and the infrastructure that's been bombed out by a conflict. This means addressing the human concerns, rebuilding the human infrastructure. Are you dealing with trauma healing? Are you healing the population at a social and psychological level, not just the physical infrastructure? Are basic needs being met? As one of my colleagues in the Democratic Republic of Congo says, you can't build peace on an empty stomach. If you're not meeting basic human needs for food and for basic human subsistence, you won't be able to move forward to building a peace in society. This is where religious actors can be very, very helpful, because religious actors are traditionally providers of social services, whether it's humanitarian assistance, whether it's food aid, whether it's education, whether it's health services. These are what religious actors do, so they can very naturally be part of that peace-building process because they're already interested in restoration of the human infrastructure in a much more holistic way. By the way, this is true in the United States as well. We have a act that's just been, a piece of law that's just been extended to give compensation to the Native Americans who were harmed by nuclear testing in the United States. And the whole impact on the humanitarian impact of war is an example of these processes of restoration. So there's lots of common practices associated with this ethical principle. It can include peace education, it can include trauma healing, looking at land rights, resettlement issues. You can use art and music as mechanisms to get at restoration of the whole human person, but it absolutely is a more holistic approach, not just looking at rebuilding roads and bridges that might have been damaged by war. Right relationship, as you can see, runs through this. If you expand participation and if you address issues of restoration, you're dealing with the other person in a much more respectful way. When you have conflicts break out, you have a dehumanization. In order to kill that other person, you have to take away their humanity, dehumanize them in some way. And so to build peace, you have to rehumanize the other side. And so these practices of right relationship can be issues of language recognition, they can be issues of religious recognition, but how are you recognizing in a respectful way people across these different identity lines? So some common practices can be making sure there's inclusion of previously marginalized groups, respecting different languages, symbols, songs, cultural expressions, as well as looking at power sharing formulas that can be more inclusive of different people from different identities. All of this helps to pave the way for reconciliation. While there's not a step-by-step, this is not a linear process, this is not a recipe with exact one-size-fits-all type of approach, reconciliation is often not the first thing done. Because unless you do some of that other work first, of expanding participation, restoration of basic human needs, and expanding right relationship, you may not be able to have a common ground for reconciliation. But reconciliation can take many different forms. I often get pushback on this from folks, folks from the military, who said it's impossible. It's impossible to do reconciliation. So folks who've come out of military service in Iraq and Afghanistan who say that will never happen. But we all, of course, we know it has happened. It's history. We know that Europe is now united and they were once divided. There have been very successful examples of reconciliation. The United States and Japan are now very close allies, and they were obviously at war. I had a chance to be in Hawaii on Pearl Harbor Day and happened to be out at the Arizona, which is where a monument to the victims of Pearl Harbor that started the U.S. intervention into World War II. And there were huge flower arrangements at the Arizona War Memorial from the Japanese as a symbol of their reconciliation with the United States. I mean, you would never have been able to imagine that in a generation ago. My grandfather fought in World War II, and afterwards, he still referred to Japanese as Japs. The Japs, okay? So reconciliation is not only possible, it's historically, it's happened all over the world. And it begins by truth-telling. By truth-telling, this can be investigations and public reports of human rights violations. This is a picture of the Ukrainians trying to document the human rights abuses as they are occurring. So they are laying the groundwork for reconciliation by trying to protect the truth even while the war is ongoing. So I don't mean to suggest you have to wait, decades later till reconciliation can take place. There are steps you can take even while the conflict is ongoing that can help prepare the ground for a more successful healing of those wounds of war later. Okay? And there's lots of different examples of that. And sustainability is looking at what are the environmental consequences of war. And how are we dealing with that at the same time in this holistic way as we're dealing with the humanitarian concerns? From my own religious tradition, Pope Francis has been really raising the concerns about the environment and our protection of the environment through Laudato Si. But this is something which secular peace builders also recognize the importance of looking at the environmental consequences of war. There's this very cruel cycle where war causes environmental degradation, but also environmental degradation is increasingly causing war. So if we look at the war in Ethiopia, as I mentioned before, that 100,000 dead in the last calendar year. I mean, horrific violence, okay? There's a lot of environmental roots to that conflict. So fighting between the pastoralists, the farmers and the ranchers, as climate change is disrupting the weather patterns and water is becoming more scarce, and there's increasing fighting throughout sub-Saharan Africa. That climate change is worsening these patterns of conflict among these different identity groups. So yes, war causes environmental damage. It causes terrible fires, releases of oil and into the atmosphere, nuclear weapons, not good for the environment, okay? But also the alternative is true as well. So if you want to protect the environment, you actually need to address these issues of war. And increasingly, if we want to decrease the number of wars, the more we can transition away from fossil fuels, the better. Because in social science, we know that there are countries that have been caught in a conflict trap. And those are countries that are reliant on natural resources like oil. And those countries often become caught in these cycles of conflict, like Nigeria, a very oil-rich country, yet has been very poor and caught in cycles of conflict. So one of the things you can do to try to lessen that conflict trap is move away from dependence on those types of fossil fuels. So while we see, obviously, some very big challenges right now, Putin is threatening to use nuclear weapons, would not be good for the environment, and would not be good for peace, okay? We also see movement to recognizing the connections between sustaining the environment and sustaining peace. And we see these great examples of people doing this type of peace building around the world. These are the Dominican Sisters of Iraq. I had the privilege of working with them and interviewing them. They literally fled ISIS with nothing but the clothes on their back in the middle of the night. And immediately, on the day of their displacement as internally displaced persons and refugees, they set up a mobile medical clinic to address the needs of others, of those who had also been displaced by ISIS. They immediately set up schools to protect the children from human trafficking from ISIS. They made sure that those schools would be co-educational. They set up after-school programming, soccer camps, etc., where the children were playing sports together, women and girls and boys, very close to the front lines with ISIS, when ISIS was saying, you know, there can be no commingling across the sexes. And they felt this was absolutely necessary to do this for conflict prevention, to protect those children, okay? And to show that there was room for these minority communities within Iraq, that they didn't have to leave the country. So it's easy to dismiss sometimes the work of religious actors, particularly women, and say, oh, well, they're just teachers, they're just nurses, that's just what they do, without realizing that they perceive the work themselves as being fundamentally about peace building. And they set up their programs with that in mind, whether they're trauma healing programs to get their youth jobs so that they're not at risk for recruitment by ISIS. So just war tradition, great. It's been institutionalized. We ought to keep it. So I'm not one of those who's arguing get rid of them. As we said, this component of just war tradition that talks about limitations on violence, very well institutionalized in the Geneva Conventions. All of these arms control agreements. You wouldn't have arms control agreements if it wasn't for just war tradition that says you should be concerned about proportionality. You should be concerned about discrimination. Therefore, there are certain types of weapons, chemical, biological, and now the latest to be outlawed and banned are nuclear weapons. those bans on chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons stem directly from just war tradition, saying they have to have protections of non-combatants. So yes, it's important, I would argue, to keep that tradition, okay? We all are very familiar with it. That's why we think the actions of groups like ISIS and their trafficking of children and capturing girls, why we think that's wrong, because we have institutionalized these ideas of just war tradition. The campaign to get rid of cluster munitions and landmines also stems directly from that just war tradition. So it's not merely an academic theory, and it's also in the militaries of the world who have military codes of justice that say, you know, soldiers can't do anything, they have to limit their use of conflict. Nonviolence is another ethical tradition, very important, got lots of success, particularly in the area of in the era of decolonization. Obviously Gandhi is a particular example, but also Martin Luther King, so many from different religious traditions that would come forward with the importance of nonviolence. Again, lots of support from social science saying, actually, what Gandhi said was true. What Martin Luther King said was absolutely accurate. When social science studies have shown, yes, nonviolence is much more effective than the use of violence. So definitely a very, very important ethical tradition. But like just war, it tells you to not use violence, but it doesn't necessarily spell out how to build peace. So these peace-building principles and practices that I've mentioned, from a religious perspective, they don't come out of the blue. They're directly components in my religious tradition of Christianity. Other religious traditions find support for these within their own religious traditions. But in my religious tradition of Christianity, this comes directly from Jesus, okay? He expanded participation. He included the enemy, including those who were trying to kill him. And he ministered and did outreach to them. He did healing of the Roman military occupying forces, yet he reached out to the Roman centurion. He practiced reconciliation with these military occupiers. He practiced restoration of traumatized population, healing people, providing food, the multiplication of the loaves and fishes. So he practiced all of these, all his life and ministries were around these just peace-building traditions. So my argument is this isn't something new. It's something we're kind of rediscovering and reapplying, but it's really been there in plain sight for a very long time. So since great power war has been declining, since we've seen a decline in these deaths from war, we have an opportunity to rethink what types of ethical tools are going to be helpful. This chart I have in here just to show you, the green here is Asia. So look at the decline, lots of green on the one side of the chart, very little green by the end. So you can see in our own geographic region here that you have experienced this decline in war from very horrific, and again, this is cutting off the worst of the violence. It's cutting off World War II in this chart, because that again would be off the charts. But if World War II was on this, you would have big, big green stripes for incredible violence, horrific violence in Asia, right? And so we see that. This one has the different types of conflict. And so I would point you to the purple and the green. The green is imperialism. So at the end, at the beginning of the last century, there were 16 empires. A lot of that war was around empires. By the end of that century, there is 0. So there's no more green stripes there because there's no more wars over empire. And again, the conflicts between states. With that decline in conflict, we have much greater prosperity, because war is terrible for prosperity. It really brings poverty. So if you have declining conflict, you're going to have much more increase in development and basic human development. And we've seen extreme poverty cut in half. But here's the challenge. The extreme poverty that remains is not equally distributed around the world. This is where most of the extreme poverty remains, in sub-Saharan Africa and also here in Asia. Why is that important to know? Well, that's where the youngest countries are on planet Earth, okay? So the youngest countries today are the poorest countries, okay? And They are the ones experiencing the most food insecurity. That's really important to know, because as I tell my students, if an old person doesn't get the meal they need in a day, that's terrible. But their brains are already developed. If a child is missing in basic nutrients, you are depriving them of a lifetime of cognitive development. So meeting those nutritional needs of children from 0 to 5 is important, but 0 to 25 is when your brain is being built, okay? So if you're not getting enough food from 0 to 25, you're going to have a lifetime of underdevelopment for you as a person and for the whole world, being robbed of your development. So it's really important that those youngest countries are the poorest. Those are the ones that need food the most right away. And those are also the countries that are most impacted by climate change, okay? So this is our cautionary tale. We can't sit back on our laurels and say, hey, Dr. Love said we're in a more peaceful time, so that's the way it's always going to be going forward. Isn't that great? You know, we can sit back and relax. Peace is breaking out. Not so fast, okay? Why else is this important? Because young people fight. Old people do not populate the armies of the world by and large, okay? To have large-scale fighting, you need to have a youth population. So where are there young people? These are the youngest countries. Those are also the poorest countries, and those are the areas most impacted by climate change. So if we want peace to be sustainable, we have to be addressing these issues in these youngest countries of the world. That's why you could see in a country like Ethiopia, it go from not a very big conflict to 100,000 dead in a year. So you have a lot of young people that can be recruited or forced into fighting positions by the various armed actors, okay? So really, really important to make sure that those young people have jobs, educational opportunities, that they're not susceptible for violence, okay? All wars end. Whether they end well or whether they end badly depends on us. It depends on what we do to build a better future, to prepare the future, and to build a more just peace. So thank you for your time. Take it down, but you can decide.
All right, so first of all, thank you very much to Dr. Love for a very mind-opening and wide-ranging talk. My name is Maryann Chung. I'm from the Department of Government and International Studies, and today I have the privilege to be one of the respondents. But since Dr. Love's talk has so much to connect with what I do on both research and teaching, my first question would be to the organizer, how much time do I have?
About 15 minutes.
Okay, then I'll try to stick to the time, because I understand that we have also, a second respondent. First thing I would like to connect with is with the name, preparing the future. I think that's the question I raised to our host, who brought Dr. Love to Hong Kong. I was once a copy editor, so I was like super careful with maybe we're missing a 4 here, and indeed learning about preparing the future as I think at some point in Germany they also a form of talking about Zukunft gestalten, to shape the future, as in instead of being proactive. I think that captures what you're talking about in the talk very nicely. Although in your unique way of combining peace building, just peace, following the Lederach tradition of just peace, and also the just war tradition, I think it's very original contribution. So I'm going to go into that. First of all, about the also, you brought in very early on about your other work of preparing the future beyond sovereignty. That's how I connect them. It's a subtitle of your book. Again, in this part of the world, I think is very relevant. I think at some point I was discussing with my students in comparative regionalism, looking at Asia, Southeast Asia, the newly independent states, how they cherish sovereignty much more than, let's say, the older democracies in Europe, and thinking about, or the readiness to channel part of the sovereignty to a supranational organization. Here, as well as I learned from my colleagues from Africa, it's that kind of readiness is not there, not yet. At some point we concluded that without that kind of readiness to upload part of the sovereignty to a higher level, probably you won't have the kind of supranational organization that has the capacity to deal with some of the internal conflicts. But again, in Europe itself, we see also beginning, currents of thought that challenge this very uploading of sovereignty, and maybe there's too much of sharing sovereignty. So we hope that on the one hand, that East Asia doesn't have to learn in the hard way, through war, that maybe sovereign state itself, the system of sovereign states, has a kind of systemic problem that makes it prone to war. I hope we can learn from Europe and create our own supranational institutions. But the core of my response would actually be on the part when you talk about reconciliation. That's really something that's very close to what I research on. Talking about reconciliation after the Second World War. Reconciliation between Japan and China, whether it is still possible, what kind of apology is acceptable. And here you mentioned something that I would like to pick up on. The first thing you mentioned about reconciliation, you talk about, is not linear. And I am completely with you. In fact, when we study, let's say, reconciliation dynamics, scholars like He Yinan, who is also an American-based Chinese scholar on reconciliation, that's what we found. Comparing Polish, German reconciliation attempts and Sino-Chinese attempts. In fact, we find some problems tend to recur, and sometimes there are breakthroughs. But a lot of times it's just a kind of dying down before it comes back again, as we observe in this part of the world. Whenever there are Yasukuni visits by Japanese prime ministers or top-ranking politicians, and depending on what Beijing wants to cultivate in Sino-Japanese relations, then that might be picked up, let's say, to make a big fuss about it. And so, this non-linearity, I think it's something that among reconciliation scholars is something we can certainly agree on. But I think something more important, substantial in that part when you talk about reconciliation is that reconciliation is possible. Whereas a lot of times in situations of conflicting parties, you mentioned the military, but I would say also in civil society as well, probably in this sense they share, is the pessimism towards reconciliation. It's not possible. Not only about old generations, sometimes with the younger ones as well, depending on what kind of education, what kind of socialization they have been going through. And in this part of the world, I would say in Hong Kong as well, Dr. Kwok mentioned just now the initiative of cultivating peace after social conflict in Hong Kong. In fact, when we try to deal with civil society partners, we also feel that kind of pessimism on the one hand, and also sometimes resistance. A lot of times, let's say we try to float ideas like, maybe we think, when we come to think of relationships that need healing, mostly at this point is really actually police-citizen relations. And once we mention this, a lot of people are like, no, it's too early. No, not in this political environment, not when the trials are still ongoing and so on. So I found your message, and I actually wrote it down. You know, it's yes, you need to prepare for the steps, prepare in the future, prepare the steps even when the conflict is still ongoing. And that when you mentioned that, I think that's really spot on. And it requires imagination. This is in fact also one of the key contributions of the early, let's say, founders of peace studies, again, like Lederach, talking about moral imagination, talking about peace building, or at that time more often referred to as conflict resolution, as a contribution to traditional IR, international relations, is innovation. Because once we got stuck into this realist, liberalist, institutionalist kind of debate, a lot of times, a lot of options are not considered at all. So I think peace building, conflict resolution can bring back, the core to, we need moral imagination to think about what kind of steps that we can take even during conflict, even during, all those court cases that, us sending our friends to jail, to think about what is even possible at this point to prepare the future rather than waiting for a future to come and then say, okay, now is the time to do reconciliation. And I think, I hope later on when we have a conversation, we can share some of these experiences that we have seen in Northern Ireland, in post-war Europe, and elsewhere, where people, despite the political environment being not conducive to reconciliation, people try to do something about it, including all those Polish, German bishops trying to exchange letters during the Cold War. So I see my Polish colleague like, no, that's not maybe a bit romanticized. Anyway, so that's the point. Hopefully later on we can have further discussion on about preparing for and also preparing steps for that kind of future for reconciliation. But one last point, I'm aware of the time that I have, which is also something that I didn't expect that you would touch on, and in fact it's a question that I have for myself, which is a more of self-critical question for peace builders, as we call ourselves, those who got trained in peace building, including the institute that I went to in Mindanao. We call ourselves peace builders, which is when you mention the need to combine just war tradition and peace building together. I keep having this question lately about my own research approach, which is when you come to peace builders, when you try to ask them, what do you think about the present Israeli-Palestinian conflict or Israeli-Hamas conflict, or any other conflict that are ongoing, we tend to say, of course we support dialogue, of course we support non-violence, of course we support de-escalation and all that. But then at some point I begin to think, aren't we a bit practicing too much of automatism? As in, you don't even need to talk to a peace activist or a peace builder, you know his answer. If we are like that, then we make ourselves completely useless. I come to think of this because recently, during one of our classes for sustainable peace, which is a GE peace, because some of our students are here, GE peace, GE curriculum here at this university, we are looking at some of the analysis of the what is called the War of Yugoslav Secession, so during the early 90s. And I remember one of the more recent accounts of that conflict by a scholar, from the region. And then the conclusion was that, based on their analysis, they thought at some point the Bosnian leadership was too naive to believe in the possibility to negotiate, to engage in conversation with the Serbian side, and that naivety, that naive attitude contributed to the total collapse of defense afterwards. Which brought me to think, well, if I were a peace builder at that time, would I counsel otherwise? Probably I would just be like an automatic, exactly like I said, automatic peace builder. Yes, of course, you support dialogue, you support conversation. But then reading that account also makes me recall, remember reading one of those traditional classic Chinese histories, like the grand records of the historian, by Sima Qian. When he mentioned, there's two nations fighting wars, at one point, one of these nations offered peace talks. And the king of the other nation just went, for peace, right? For dialogue. What happened? He was killed. His nation was eliminated. Again, it points me to ask ourselves, peace builders or peace building scholars, would we have advised otherwise? And what would that otherwise look like? I think today in your talk, you offer a plausible answer, which I would like to really further engage with you in the conversation and perhaps afterwards as well. How do we combine just war tradition and peace building to make us, as in people doing research on peace building, less automatic? Would we really be at position to say to certain conflict parties, no, this is not the right time to engage in dialogue, or at least not in that format? This is not the time to talk about de-escalation, which I feel as a peace builder, no, of course we always support de-escalation, but would we really be at a place analytically to say, no, this is not the right time? Now, for the last piece of my remark, I just want to go to a conversation lately I had with my wife. When we were watching news, and the Hong Kong news was, about, we know what the status of the Hong Kong news has become recently. So there was a piece of news about the United States blocking the Security Council proposal by Russia about the talk about secession or de-escalation, stopping the conflict in Israel and Palestine. And my wife asked me, why would the United States do that? And I go I'm not a supporter of the United States or anything, but in international relations and political science, there's a consensus that at any point when there's a conflict, you try to stop it, it's going to benefit one side over the other. So it's not something neutral. At any point you want to freeze the conflict, you benefit one side over the other. So in this particular conflict, I said, well, if you call for stoppage of whatever Israel is doing, then the objective fact, I'm not justifying one side or the other, okay? The objective fact is the hostage would be kept and nobody's going to do anything about it. Or nobody is in the power to do anything about it. So that's the problem. So once again, going back to your core idea of combining peace building and just war doctrine or just war tradition, I just have this question. What can the just war tradition bring to peace builders, peace scholars, so that we are not that automatic? We can perhaps talk about, when we talk about just war, can we talk about just armament? Now again, I'm moving a little top a bit like a hawkish scholar, just armament or just preparation for war that would, perhaps at the end bring the outcome of peace more likely? I'm just having these questions. I don't have answers yet. As I told you, your talk really brought some of these thoughts and reflections that I've been having for some time as somebody, of course, I support dialogue, I support peace, but I don't want to be an automatic moron. As in, whatever you ask me, I say, okay, of course, you go for dialogue. Maybe not. So with that, I conclude with, I think we can also quote from religious sources because Dr. Love has started it. Of course, Jesus talked about, I'm sending you, meaning his disciples, like sheep among wolves. So be as wary as serpents, but as innocent as doves. So I think peace builders has been, a lot of dove talking, dove behaving, but that wariness as the serpents, perhaps I think the work of Dr. Love can bring a bit more of that towards the conversation. So Thank you.
Thank you both to Dr. Chung and to Dr. Love. It's very hard for me to follow these because I am not a social scientist. I don't do a lot of activism in war zones. I am a rather small ethicist. So my comments, and more importantly, I have not written much about the ethics of just war and peace, but I think these comments remind me of so much of my early studies and important foundational, fundamental studies. To begin with, I began my undergraduate program in a time when the United States was engaged in conflict in the Middle East. And my undergraduate major was actually Arabic because I had in mind that I was going to serve my country in this conflict. But very quickly, I discovered the humanity of my professors, most of whom were Arabs, most of whom had lived in Lebanon and Syria and had a different perspective from what I heard in the news and what I heard from talk show hosts and so forth. And it changed my perspective. I almost dropped out of the program, but my advisor, he said, no, stay in because you'll get a job. And clearly I'm working in Arabic as a translator now. I'm not, obviously. But what I noticed going through this program is that I had many colleagues, many peers who were in the Reserve Officer Training Corps program for US military, who remained studying Arabic and had the idea that they were going to fight. And over the course of the years, I never saw them develop the same sense of humanity. I often heard them using pejorative terms for Arabs, which shocked me, given how we shared classes with Arab professors. So I'm very much aware then of this problem of dehumanization. I think this is an important problem that comes to the heart of a lot of conflict, of armed conflict. And in philosophy, we often talk about the master-slave dialectic from Hegel, who has this notion that human beings are engaged in this struggle over one another. And of course, it's articulated by Karl Marx, who thinks that the history of society, of civilization, is the history of conflict, of one side trying to gain strength over the other, and that you can summarize all of world history as conflict. But ironically, there's something about this that we know is not entirely true. We do experience camaraderie, do experience friendship. We do see people as companions. We do see their humanity. And so most of all, I'm reminded of the story of Martin Heidegger. Heidegger was a brilliant German philosopher in the 1920s and 30s. He was the rising star of German philosophy. And in 1933, he joined the Nazi Party. And he joined the Nazi Party when his mentor, his teacher, Edmund Husserl, was a Jew. And Husserl was the rector of the University of Freiburg. He was essentially the president, would be the president in many other universities. And so Husserl, as a Jew, was taken from his post, and Heidegger was given his post for being a Nazi. And beyond this, many of Heidegger's students were Jews as well. So many of those Jewish students fled. A lot of them came to the United States in the end. Hannah Arendt, Hans Jonas, Herbert Marcuse. Some went other places. Emmanuel Levinas ended up in France fighting for the resistance against the Nazis. And most of their philosophy for the rest of their lives can be summed up as trying to make sense of Heidegger. How can you be the smartest philosopher in your country and do something so horrific as joining the Nazis when your students are Jews, when your mentor is a Jew? How can you do something like this? This is the great mystery. This is a very profound problem, because it tells us that being brilliant is not the same thing as being good. And Emmanuel Levinas tried to make sense of this, not just for Heidegger, but for many of the Germans. His conclusion was that the Germans had failed to look upon their Jewish neighbors and see their face. So Levinas's philosophy emphasizes that the encounter with the other, face-to-face encounter, is an encounter of vulnerability, because when I see the other, I see a face that is mortal, that can be killed. And this face that is mortal and can be killed commands me, with no language, thou shalt not kill. So Levinas says this is the problem. Heidegger put being above everything else. He was a philosopher of being. And he spent his whole career, even after World War II, and he was disgraced and had to leave the university, he kept writing about being. What is being? And Levinas said, no, first philosophy is ethics. First philosophy is recognizing that the person before me is vulnerable and I have an obligation to them. And that the problem was that the Jews were taken to Auschwitz and Dachau and all the other death camps. They were loaded up in these trains because their German neighbors refused to see their faces. But we know, and we know the horror, we know we use this term Holocaust sometimes to refer to what happened, but the preferred term is Shoah, means horror, because 6 million Jews were killed, and of course this was a major impetus for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which we're celebrating this year, the 75th anniversary. We know that the world recognized how awful this was and said never again, although genocides happened again. And we know how significant this is, but it's also important to know that there were people who did see humanity. So Hans Jonas, one of Heidegger's other students, another Jewish student who fled, and Jonas fled to Palestine at the time, which was occupied by the British, and he joined the Jewish Brigade, which fought against the Nazis. And he came to Germany. He found that his mother died in Auschwitz. And so he couldn't return, he couldn't stay in Germany after World War II, not with the pain he had in that country. So he returned to Israel when it became a state. But then he saw what the Israelis were doing to Palestinians. And he said, I can't be part of this country. This is what I left. How can I be here? So he immigrated to Canada, and then his friend Hannah Arendt invited him to come to the United States. And at the end of his life, he was asked to give a talk about racism. Somebody who experienced racism in a very literal way, and somebody who had written a lot about moral responsibility. He was in a good place to write about this. And his talk is the last writing he wrote just months before he died. It's very insightful because it addresses questions of the environment. In fact, he speaks of the outcry of mute things. He says that we do need to address these problems of racism, but in this talk, he gives an account of 2 Jewish women who fled from Germany, and they fled to this small Italian village. And they were worried, of course, that the fascists would find them and would send them back to Germany or execute them themselves. But somehow, during the course of World War II, nobody bothered them. Nobody came in. The fascists came through town, and nobody ever ratted them out. And these 2 Jewish women from Germany, they recounted that people had always taken care of them. Because they were refugees, they didn't have bank accounts, they didn't have access to government cars to get resources, but somehow they always found an extra cup of butter in their cupboards. They found a neighbor had too much flour and gave them more than they needed. People gave them eggs. Somehow they always had enough. The people of this Italian town saw the humanity of these 2 Jewish sisters who had fled. They recognized their humanity. They recognized their faces. And so they were able to support them, care for them. As a Guelo, you can tell, right? I'm not from Hong Kong. One of the things that's fascinated me most about moving here is that Hong Kongers are the same humans. Now, there are differences, obviously, cultural differences, religious differences in many cases, linguistic differences, but every person I encounter is a unique and indispensable person. Every face I see is a face, true human being. And during the pandemic, it was very hard because everybody was wearing masks. And when we were on Zoom for class, I couldn't see any faces. This was very hard. But now we see each other, and it's important to keep this in mind. And I think when we think about conflict, when we think about war, when we think about violence, ultimately part of the problem of war has to be that we stop seeing the other as a human being. So that part of the solution for just peace must be emphasizing the humanity of those in front of us, of those around us. So just as a conclusion, a few years ago, I happened to be in Korea, and Japan has come up now twice, so let this be the lucky number 3, I guess. I was in Korea, and I was in Seoul, happened to be in Seoul on a Thursday, and it's Wednesday. And there was a gathering in front of the Japanese embassy, large gathering of many different people. In the center of this gathering, there were these 2 old women in their 80s or 90s. They were all who remained of women who are called the comfort women. This is a euphemism, because the comfort women were sexual slaves for the Japanese army. Because after the Japanese army invaded Nanjing, it was a horrific atrocity of mass rapes. So the Japanese army instituted this policy of bringing prostitutes with them, but they didn't have enough prostitutes from Japan. So they took Korean women, often teenage girls, who were part of their colonial heritage, and they shipped them to the army bases. And these women were forced to serve as sexual slaves for the army. After World War II, nobody heard about this. It was covered up. There were the reconciliation committees and war crime trials in Nuremberg and other places. But what happened in Korea was covered up until the 1990s. And then women began telling their stories. And reading the stories is absolutely heartbreaking. It is difficult to do without crying, to be quite honest. And these women have been seeking just for an honest admission of what happened, of what was done to them. But this has not been forthcoming. The Japanese government has not admitted this. And so to this day, Koreans, largely, many Koreans have a lot of anger, a lot of hostility towards Japanese because of what happened during colonization, because of what happened to the comfort women, and that there hasn't been an attempt to really encounter each other with reconciliation, with truth. So the reality is, as Dr. Love said, we need to be able to encounter each other with reconciliation, but that requires admitting what happened, admitting the truth, admitting our own mistakes, and prioritizing the voices of those who have been ignored, to see the humanity of those who have been neglected, whose rights have been trampled, and to hear their stories. Thank you. I shouldn't put this down since I'm chair. I would like to invite Dr. Love.
Our guest. First of all, about face-to-face encounters and humanity of revealing your face. I have to say I find it very disturbing to be in Hong Kong, in a sense, where I see so many people still covering their faces and not really showing their humanity, in a sense. I think but it's on the sidelines anyway. As a Polish, I have to say, Poland is very often used as an example when it comes to reconciliation. Poland, Germany, Poland, Russia, Second World War, you alluded to that. I'm aware of the existing literature and the so-called mainstream academic view that, you know, this is more or less sorted out. It's not. It's not. And I don't think it will ever be unless Germans and the Russians change their attitude. The fundamental problem being the truth. The truth has never been admitted fully by those countries. So even though, you know, mainstream academia, mainstream media would have you believe that, oh yeah, reconciliation is perfectly fine in Europe. It's not. Unfortunately, it's not. And it's not only my view as an academic, but also my personal view. My grandfather fought in the Second World War, and I had stories from him, absolutely heartbreaking. That has never been recognized by the other parties. Nonetheless, 3 questions that I have. As we are in a very difficult time right now, and of course, you know, we all know what's happening in the Middle East between Israel and Palestinian Authority. Regardless of, you know, who's right, who's not right, peace building. What do you think? I mean, I'm sure you ask this question a lot these days, and you're going to be asked. What would be your advice to all the parties, to United Nations? You know, how to reconcile this terrible humanitarian catastrophe that is happening in front of our eyes on both sides. I mean, you know, at the end of the day, as we all know, it's the civilians that pay the highest price. This is the first question. The second, because I come from security studies, we talk a lot about privatization of security, and so I'm wondering whether, in your you know, rich experience in the field, you have any thoughts on how private actors, non-state actors, contribute to peace building, because they certainly do contribute to wars. And the third question is, you said in the title of your talk is preparing the future. So what was that future of peace building? Is that supranationalism, or what is it? Because I'd like you to elaborate on that. Thank you very much.
So all easy questions, thank you. I'll just take the last one first, just randomly. The future of peace building, the way I see it is not necessarily supranationalism. So when I talk about beyond sovereignty, that doesn't mean a United Nations or a world government. I think we're more complex than that. And so I think that oftentimes you can have regional solutions, you can have local solutions. I see this as both and. When the problems are this severe, we need all hands on deck. We need subsidiarity, we need local peace building that can handle these problems close to the root. You need the regional to come in to be able to